Welcome to the Sandbox Summit, and I'm Wendy Smolin. Before we start, Claire and I want to thank a lot of people, but we'll skip the Academy Awards. And first, we do want to thank, though, Scott, the MIT Education Arcade, Comparative Media Studies, and our Sandcastle sponsor, VTech, our Playdate sponsors, Frog Design, TIA, the Eric Carle Museum of Picture Book Art, and 360 Public Relations, and our media sponsors, Technosource, Women in Children's Media, and YPulse. Okay, now let's begin. When Claire and I first envisioned the summit, we wanted to introduce it with a message that showed how important play is, always has been, and always will be. So we asked Justin Johnson of Online Video Contests and Next New Networks to give us his interpretation. While we, Claire and I, were literally thinking about the history of play, Justin thought across platforms, giving us a true sense of what transmedia is about, and it's the next generation of play.
Ooga, ooh, ooh, ooh. Ooga, ooga.
Ooga, 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 ooga. Ooga, 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 Eddie.
Ooda, ooh. Ooga, 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 ooga. Ooga, ooga, ooga.
Ooga, 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 ooga.
Ooga, 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 ooga.
Best pizza in Boston. Because he really, 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 really likes pizza.
I really like it a lot.
So anybody who can help Justin with a recommendation for pizza in Boston or Cambridge, please see Justin afterwards.
So sorry, man.
Good morning and welcome to the Sandbox Summit. We're really glad. Oh my. I must have taller shoes on today. We're really glad you could be with us this morning. For those of you who aren't at MIT on a regular basis, either teaching or studying, don't you just feel smarter being in this room? I do. Our agenda today is overflowing with innovative thinkers and doers. The stellar roster of speakers and panelists and workshop leaders is, in our humble opinions, unprecedented. Each one of you, excuse me, it's all that really good Cambridge water. Each one of you, presenter or participant, comes equipped with a passion for your work, a commitment to the synergy of learning and play, and an insatiable curiosity looking for new ways to teach kids how fun it is to learn something new. So without further delay, we'd like to introduce Henry Jenkins, who knows all about fun and learning and all about new ways to look at things and new perspectives. And he is the, I can't say granddad, no, we'll say, he will introduce us all to what transmedia is and talk about how play is changing media and media is changing play. Henry Jenkins.
Well, good morning. I think I've decided that no matter how far away I move or what I do in life, I will always end up back in Bartos again. But many of you have seen me speak here in Bartos before, and I'm happy to be re-engaged with you now. So the talk I'm going to give today is called Toying with Transmedia. The future of transmedia is child's play. And I found on Google Images this image of people playing in the sand. It seemed appropriate for our occasion. And it suggested I'm going to talk about my concept of transmedia, but talk about how transmedia emerges in many ways from the play of previous generations of media makers. In fact, I'm going to make the argument that in many ways, contemporary transmedia is media produced by the generation that grew up playing He-Man for the generation that's growing up playing Pokemon. In the sense that those two franchises embody particular properties of media and the ways we play with or fantasize about media that I think exert a powerful impact on the kinds of stories we tell, the kinds of culture we create. Because for me, play is about creativity. It's about innovation and experimentation. It's about a sense of discovery. And that's really what I want to carry through with this. Now, transmedia is a word that's very much in the news right now. Indeed, this is the one of many announcements of the Producers Guild of America recently created a whole new job classification called transmedia producers, which is really partially the effort of Jeff Gomez of Starlight Runner, who really lobbied aggressively in the industry for that level of recognition. And there, the definition is any story that's told across at least 3 media that have at least 3 major storylines. So that's his definition. We'll get a more elaborate one as we go forward, but the key idea is telling a story across media. Telling a story, I would say, in an integrated way across media. Now, so here's my definition. Transmedia storytelling represents a process where integral elements of a fiction get dispersed systematically across multiple delivery channels. I don't say at least 3. I think you could do it well with 2, but that's close enough, for the purpose of creating a unified and coordinated entertainment experience. Ideally, each medium makes its own unique contribution to the unfolding of the story. So the idea for me of a unique contribution partially separates out what we're calling transmedia from traditional kinds of adaptation or marketing, which were, in fact, historically, there's a great deal of redundancy in each of those media segments. There's only one central text. So just to clarify, this is an example of transmedia storytelling. The Dark Lord, The Rise of Darth Vader, it takes the character of Darth Vader out of the Star Wars films and integrates him into a book form. This Star Wars breakfast cereal probably is not transmedia, right? In fact, arguably, the fact that the stormtroopers are made out of marshmallows probably contradicts a great deal of the continuity of the Star Trek or Star Wars universe. But it is transmedia branding. It's suggesting that branding alongside play, alongside performance, alongside style and fashion, or other kinds of transmedia logics that we have to talk about and factor in. And those can be overlapping categories. One can be branding and tell a story. I don't happen to think the Star Wars breakfast cereal does that, but we can imagine a breakfast cereal, perhaps, that added something vital to the experience of the story. Popeye Spinach, for example, might be seen as allowing us to embody and take in something and have a fantasy life around spinach and Popeye that would be, in fact, part of the story. Now, this is the interesting limit case, the action figure, right? Because I want to argue throughout this talk that action figures have been a key element in paving the way for transmedia storytelling by putting an authoring tool in the hands of the player. That is, by having something that embodies and represents part of the story, it says, here are the characters, what are you going to do with them? And that invitation is one that I think has been taken up by the current generation of people, like my son, who's now 29, who grew up with these action figures and have a very different relationship to media than I think the previous generations necessarily had. All right, another key distinction. Hamlet, as this version of Mel Gibson's version of Hamlet, is an adaptation. We've basically taken Shakespeare's play, we've adapted to another medium, no one's changed anything radical about the storyline, Obviously, adaptation has some degree of interpretation and different meanings come out, but essentially it's the same story in a different medium. Whereas Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead takes secondary characters out of Hamlet, expands the world from their point of view, and arguably adds another text, maybe not, since they're both in theater, maybe not transmedia text, but adds another text to the experience of the story of Hamlet. And so this is an extension. Hamlet itself is an adaptation. All right, so let me pull this into the world of play for us. This is an article that my son and I both spotted in IO9 a couple of weeks ago. And IO9 is a really good blog on all things geeky, science fiction, comics, games, so forth. This one is the 10 most unfortunate masters of the universe toys. And my son, who's 29, a freelance writer in Seattle, and he and I are on the Skype to each other just walking through them, and we remembered every one of these toys. I mean, here's some of the ones that I pulled out that I thought were particularly amazing toys. There's Mossman, who's covered with fuzz. There's Stinkor, who has a built-in smell, stinks up the toy room. Mosquitoer has blood pack that squirts through his body as he drains blood out of his victims. These were amazing toys, right? And my son remembered all of them, as did I. In fact, we had probably 8 of the 10 that they identified there at one time or another in our He-Man collection from when he was growing up. And so we can think about, why do we remember these toys so vividly? And one level is that they were really well-designed toys. They captured the imagination. They had distinctive properties that appealed to kids' sense of tactility and smell and, their gore instincts, whatever. Peggy Cherin, at the time this stuff was being produced here for Action on Children's Television, would say it's because the show itself was nothing more than a 30-minute commercial for the toys. And that was the critique that came out during that period of time, that this was the destruction of storytelling, that there would be no good stories that came out because it was all driven by toy manufacture and marketing. And there were other critics at the time who talked about the shortcake strategy as a way of evacuating story and replacing it with commodity in American television. But that doesn't account for the vivid role these characters still play in the imaginary life of my 29-year-old son, who has stories attached to all of these figures, who remembers them vividly. And some of those stories come from the television show, and some of them come from his own play. But they were part of a larger mythology. And this is not my son's collection. I found this one online. My son probably had 3 to 4 times the number of He-Man toys you were up there. We became obsessed as a family with collecting these things and playing. But he played with them endlessly. And it intrigues me that they get laid out. There's a whole genre of pictures on the web where adults have laid out their He-Man toys in displays, showing that they still held on to these characters. They still had a continuing life in their imagination. And at the time this was going on, there was a show on called Max Headroom that had a character named Bryce, who in one episode referred to still having, in this near future science fiction story, still having a complete set of the original He-Man action figures. And that's a joke, became a joke in our family, as we still do have most of the toys Henry had in that set. Now, these are the action figures of my generation. These were called Sokies. Bubble Bath came in these. But there are still, I've been rebuying them on eBay myself, and they represented the fictional characters of my generation that I played with endlessly in my sandbox. In fact, growing up, that they allowed me to, again, borrow characters. What's striking is the same soap company, if we look at it, has, there's Bambi up there from Disney, there's Yogi Bear from Hanna-Barbera, there's Speedy Gonzales from Warner Brothers, all owned by the same soap company, right? So all of the major stories, animators were dumping their stuff into this one soap company to produce these toys. So it was not separate lines. It was all part of an integrated line, which changes, I think, the ways we think about it. Now, the idea that we play with the stories of our culture is not new. And in fact, if we go to these classic children's books like Tom Sawyer, Anne of Green Gables, Little Women, all of them depict kids at play in the 19th century. And all of them depict kids at play with stories of their culture. Maybe most vividly, you may remember Meg in Little Women plays out Pilgrim's Progress. That in Anne of Green Gables, there's a whole sequence around playing Lady in the Lake and King Arthur. And Tom Sawyer plays Robin Hood. Right? So in each of those, they're playing stories and narratives that had an enormous role in their culture. And we can place the action figure within that larger history of playing with the stories that matter, playing with the stories that are part of the mythology of your life. Now, my experience as a father at the time, my most vivid memories of the He-Man dolls was walking into his bedroom barefoot in the middle of the night when he had a bad dream and having one of these pieces of molded plastic stuck in my bare foot, yanking it out and going, Chila, and hearing my son look at it studiously and say, no, Dad, it's sorceress. And the sense that he invested particularity with each of the artifacts attached to these dolls, that they came as figures, but they also came with objects, and these objects formed a complete set of a character. They were capacities for action, they were elements of a story, they fit together to form that mythology, I think is part of what we have to remember about action figures. And in turn, we can use the action figure to play out our fantasies, our imagination in the backyard, in the sandbox, in the playroom. They become avatars that we project ourselves into, but in projecting ourselves into it, we also typically, kids imitate different voices, they embody different personalities, they try on different roles. And so they play a really important role, I think, in kids' construction of their own identity. What we would call an adolescence identity play begins, I think, with personification and characterization around action figures. This I thought was beautiful. Some adult had painted this picture of his array of He-Man action figures. And it's nicely painted piece of fan art that captures, again, the memories he has of growing up with these toys. Now, if we go back to He-Man, He-Man as a system already points toward what we're calling transmedia. So here in the center here, we have the Filmation cartoon. We have here the sticker. These are 3D stickers down below. That's a sticker book for normal stickers up there. These on the other side are the comic books that came with the toys. So that the story of He-Man was embodied in the cartoon, embodied in the action figure, and surrounding it were very specific mythologies around each of the characters that emerged through collecting the stickers and by reading the comic books that came inside. So it was already a beginning of what we would think of as a transmedia system. It also allows us, it also became part of the mythology of other rituals around childhood. So here we see some pictures I found on the web of kids dressed as He-Man for costume parties at Halloween. Or here are kids' birthday cakes designed with He-Man and She-Ra on it. So we take it and it becomes ours, it becomes part of our everyday life by being spread across these other channels. And whether we want to see the cake as transmedia branding or as transmedia storytelling, we'll have to decide. And minimally, it's transmedia style, and that the look and feel of these cakes reflects something of the aesthetic look and feel of He-Man. And in turn, kids embodied it in their creative life. This is a picture of a coloring book, but in fact, my son, like many kids, drew pictures, wrote stories, dramatized the story. He-Man, the mythology took on a life of its own and fed his creative processes in a variety of ways. Of course, He-Man is only part of a larger set of collectibles during that same period. So I found the site that collects the Planet of the Apes, the Star Trek, Doctor Who. My son's would have been World Wrestling Federation. But all of these sort of sets of toys came as both a completely contained world, and more interestingly, they're often stored like this, with different mythologies mixed and matched in the toy box together. And of course, kids would take those out and combine them to create new mythologies, to recast parts if they didn't have the right action figures, so that Pee-wee ends up playing a character in the He-Man Adventures or whatever. That sense of combining the characters across mythologies and also doing crossover stories, meet-up stories, match-up stories, so forth, become parts of how kids play with action figures. And I just brought in this, the Superman and the Masters of the Universe comic that suggests that it wasn't just kids who were combining the characters, that the culture of the time would cross over and combine mythologies. And there's something really fascinating that sparks fly for me when I see characters from two distinct worlds brought together to form a new mythology. Now, what we're discovering is that those kids have grown up and they're moving to the era of YouTube. They're, in fact, creating things out of their experience of these media. And I'm going to play this one first. Hopefully, it'll come up. So that's one of a number of videos that Probot has produced. But Probot is one of dozens of websites that are out there that are using action figures to create original movies. This one is a lovingly recreation of a specific moment from Indiana Jones. And I love that crossover moment with Chewbacca at the end because it does remind us of that experience of playing with crossovers among action figures. Here's another video that's a popular web series on YouTube. This one called The Skeletor Show, which puts us, again, in the world of He-Man.
Yo, what's up?
Want to see something funny?
Yeah, of course I want to see something funny. Show me something funny.
All right, watch this. Oh, man, did you see?
Hey!
What?
That wasn't funny at all.
What do you mean? Look at it.
That was not funny. There were kids in there.
Oh, I didn't think about that. Maybe there were kids in there. I didn't really.
That's right, and they probably had little kitty cats.
Kitties? Well, I didn't want to kill a kitty. You're right. What have I done? Kitty!
I'm just kidding. That was hilarious. They blowed up good. So I was saying to Mindy the other day that there are many great skin products people can use these days, you know. Skin products, moisturizers, things that could make your skin supple and smooth.
What are you moisturizers? What are you babbling on about?
I was just thinking, your skin, it's just so...
I don't have any skin.
What?
I don't have any skin. Look at me. Why do you think I'm called Skeletor?
I just thought your parents gave you a funny name.
My parents gave me a funny name? What, do you think my parents named me Skeletor? Did your parents name you Evil Lynn?
No, of course not. I wasn't named Evil Lynn. I was named Lynn.
Shut up. Do you want something?
All right. So there's a whole series of these on the web, and I definitely recommend them as pretty fun examples of remix video that are out there. But again, you picture this as some 20-something who grew up watching the cartoon show, playing with the toys, and beginning to become a media creator, and their imagination goes back to the mythologies and the modes of storytelling that were part of their childhood play. I think the same mentality produces the Star Wars, the Lego saga games, which again go back to the playroom and reimagine it in contemporary video. Or something like Robot Chicken on MTV grows directly out of the action figure cinema. You know, this is part of the Adult Swim Robot Chicken Star Wars parody. Here's Todd McFarlane, who's the father of the modern action figure. Todd McFarlane, who did Spawn, goes on to create a whole series of action figures for adults. These are just some of the variety of different kinds of action figures for adults. That's Seven Samurai. This one comes out of Japan, not a Todd McFarlane product, but I love the set comes complete with Akira Kurosawa directing the scene. We see the German expressionist. This is a Todd McFarlane, did the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari action figures. We have adult entertainment action figures. And I lost the name of the movie. Big Lebowski action figures, yes. So again, examples of how this generation that grew up playing with He-Man is now changing our media. So listen, I'm not going to walk through all of my properties of transmedia storytelling. This is from my blog a few months ago. This is a talk that I gave at Futures of Entertainment. But if we think about these categories up here, the idea of entertainment as a media system that spreads, and we actively spread the media with us, as well as the capacity to drill down deep into any given media property. The idea of elaborate continuities, complex systems versus multiplicities, the ability to imagine many different versions of the same character. The idea of immersion, of going into the world versus extractability, taking the world out with us and carrying it into the world, into our imaginary space. The idea of world building, seriality, subjectivity, and performance. We can see the He-Man had them all. That the He-Man system already points toward everything that I would see as characteristic of our present moment of transmedia. In a sense, the modern sense of transmedia is born through that medium. So we can see modern transmedia as doing the same thing, extracting elements of the world, putting them out there for us to play around with. And the idea of the park bench a la District 9 is it's both a piece of exposition, that is, it already introduces the notion of segregation and of aliens and humans. It's a play space. We can perform there. I've always wanted to take a picture of a cat sitting on one of those benches looking kind of, you're going to tell me to get off? But, you know, and it also is a piece of branding. And it carries over to the web. District 9 has websites. This is an aliens' rights website, which allows us to imagine the world from the point of view of the equivalent of Skeletor or Evil Lyn, and that is the sort of constructed evil at least at the beginning of the movie. We can see something like True Blood takes this out into the branding space and creates fake advertisements and billboards and posters for the True Blood products. We can see travel posters that are made for the web or for promotion that encourage us to imagine ourselves visiting these remarkable worlds that appear in our favorite media franchises. When we talk to the people who build it, they are in fact often of that generation that grew up playing action figures. That's me talking to Mark Warshaw during an interview I did in Brazil. And Mark talks always about Star Wars as the beginning of his ideas. Mark has gone on to work on Smallville, on Heroes, on Melrose Place, developing a lot of elaborate transmedia franchises. But he says that everything he knows about transmedia, he learned playing with Star Wars action figures and comic books and board games and so forth growing up. And this is Jeff Gomez, who I mentioned earlier. Jeff, when he came to talk to my class at USC on transmedia, spent half the period talking about being a dungeon master at Dungeons & Dragons and how he learned world building, the process of building up his mythology by playing at this game, Dungeons & Dragons, and then the ability to control people's entertainment experience, to shape their emotional responses. Everything he learned about authoring, he says, he learned from being a dungeon master. Now, just as my son might have had that complex mythology of toys arranged on this floor, modern transmedia franchises have that sense of many, many movable parts. They're based on an ensemble cast structure, which is what many critics responded to negatively in He-Man. Had generated so many characters, none of them had psychological depth, was the argument. That there was no compelling, vivid character. There was no one you could identify with, and in fact, there were many people you could identify with. This happens to be the command chart for the Zion Resistance Army in the Matrix movies. This is the relationship chart for the X-Men universe and explains why I can't pick one up and just read it. Right? Just by way of comparison, that's the families from War and Peace. I asked you, when people talk about dumbing down popular culture and the complexity of Russian novels, just keep those two images juxtaposed in your mind. And you realize that, in fact, pop culture demands more of us and our children than most of the classics ever did. And that it was time that we're, you know, so here's Pokemon. I mentioned Pokemon earlier. Each of those characters has antagonisms and friendships, has powers, has weaknesses, has multiple states of being. This is a system far more complex than the periodic table. You know, and our schools are telling kids they can't learn 12 Greek gods. You know, this is what our kids are learning on the playground. And Mimi Ito, who's written about this stuff, says that because of this complex system, there's a kind of an early style of collective intelligence that emerges. When any two kids meet on the playground, they immediately start comparing notes because they all know different parts of the system. And they each can be an expert, and they each can pool knowledge, and they can learn from each other as they talk on the playground about the properties of this large, expansive set that constitutes a modern media franchise. Again, a lot of this stuff grows out of the childhood experiences. So Pokemon itself, the people who produced Pokemon says that they grew up playing beetle battles, which is apparently a popular hobby in Japan. And you can see the connections between this Japanese kid watching these two beetles battling out in a ring and the properties of various media versions of Pokemon are very much in common. Here's Shigeru Miyamoto, the great game designer, who says his idea of Super Mario Brothers came out of spelunking, out of being a caver as a kid and exploring spaces that he didn't know where they were going to end up, secret passageways and so forth. That this fed into his design of the Super Mario Brothers games. So just as the Americans grew up playing He-Man, the Japanese grew up with these other pastimes, and it gets embodied in the kind of media they produce, the kind of stories they tell, and the kind of entertainment experience they pass on to the next generation. And as that happens, then we want to think, well, what's the next generation going to do? If this is the raw materials, Super Mario, Pokemon are the raw materials out of which the next generation of storytellers are going to create their worlds and their stories, what will that look like, given the cycle I've shown here in terms of He-Man beginning to shape our culture? I really love the recent Tim Burton Alice in Wonderland. It got totally trashed by critics. In part, it got trashed because it wasn't a literal adaptation of the book Alice in Wonderland. But it, in fact, invites us to think about a different history of Alice in Wonderland, which is a story that was always being retold, a story that was expanded not by the author. Lewis Carroll has a couple of Alice books. But this book, Alternative Alice's Visions and Revisions of Lewis Carroll's Alice books, captures 20-something out of more than 200 original novels published set in the world of Alice in Wonderland in the first 20 years after Lewis Carroll published his book. Doing what Tim Burton's movie does, take the Mad Hatter and makes her an appropriate lover for an adult Alice, exploring it from different political points of view, exploring alternative endings, suggesting this process of play, again, with the materials of our culture goes way, way back. And I would say any history of transmedia is full of accounts from children's literature. So I'm going to walk us through a couple of others. But Alice, I think, is interesting. Alice in Wonderland is a story that just continually gets retold. This is Alan Moore's Lost Girls, which has Wendy, Dorothy, and Alice as his central protagonists. This is the Schrenkmeyer Alice. This is a recent Sci-Fi Channel Alice. This is a manga Alice, recently published. This is American McGee's Alice, which was a video game series. This is Alice in Sunderland, a really amazing comic by Brian Talbot. Matt Hatter H, or the Looking Glass Wars. Looking Glass Wars are books. Hatter H's comics that tell a different version of Alice in Wonderland, and so forth. So the story of Alice in Wonderland was continually available to be retold. And it's a beautiful illustration of what I call multiplicity, a kind of key principle of transmedia, which is that we can imagine the characters in different ways. That one way to extend the story is through continuity, telling the same story across multiple media channels and creating an integrated experience. The other is multiplicity, taking the same characters and giving us different looks at them as they're inserted into radically different stories. And you can get to both of those from the kind of bedroom sandbox play that I was talking about earlier. Now this Felix on the Chevrolet dealerships on the edge of the USC campus. And so I see it every morning going in to work, and it's always an inspiration to me. And partially what it inspires me to think about is how far back the idea goes of taking characters and spreading them across media channels. So Felix was a comic strip character adapted to animation, who became a stage play. There was stage play at the time and sheet music at the time. There was plush toys at the time. He was one of the first characters broadcast on American television, one of the major networks. That was their initial broadcast symbol. So Felix was a transmedia personality. The difference is that Felix had amnesia, that Felix didn't remember who he was from one medium to the next. Right? Each story is self-contained. Even the individual cartoons have no seriality, no continuity. They are just individual stories involving this character. But if we think about characters like Felix or Mickey Mouse or Bugs Bunny, their spread across media already points to the fact that a character could live in multiple media spaces. And again, it was explored first, I would argue, by characters who aimed at children and the childlike adult. L. Frank Baum is another early thinker about the system, and Baum comes much closer to a modern sense of transmedia. Again, Wizard of Oz we think of today as a single story, and mostly we think of the plot of the MGM musical, which is partially the plot of the original Wizard of Oz book. But in fact, there were 20-something Oz books that Baum wrote himself, Baum also produced films that had their own original stories, and Baum created stage plays. And most interestingly, he did lectures where he brought in clips from his movies and slides he created specifically for the lecture and presented himself as a geographer who showed us the world of Oz. And that tells us the fact that Baum labels himself the royal geographer of Oz tells us that he understood Oz as a world much more than as a story or in a story system. That the Oz as a world was full of interesting nooks and corners we could explore. And this is one of the original Oz movies that Baum created himself. And it's full of these moments where the characters arrive in a new land, are greeted by the curious people who live there, are shown often have to explore mazes, caverns, passageways, and meet a boss that they have to challenge and overcome. So that these are very episodic, self-contained little snippets that are part of the larger geography of the world of Oz as Baum imagined it. They often were designed to take advantage of early special effects technology. Things that we encounter in a contemporary video game. As we go forward in our history of the ideas that build into modern transmedia, we'd also have to include J.R.R. Tolkien, who probably is not a children's writer, but is a fantasy writer. But his work, I think, grows out of, again, of a childlike imagination of how do we imagine the world. And one of the things that's important about him is he didn't just create the stories of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but these elaborate mythologies, this encyclopedia and concordance of references. That's in sort of the notion of these transmedia stories as encyclopedic, as worlds that have much more complexity in them that can be told, can be substantiated in any single story, becomes part of what makes transmedia interesting. That Tolkien, like Baum, as a map maker, fleshes out the geography of his space and holds open lands that have no stories taking place in them, so the readers can project their own imagination over what's going on in those yet undescribed segments of the map. And he also was a songwriter, right? So the idea that he wrote songs that run through those books, various people have set them to music. The modern folk music movement, which is folk music based in fantasy and science fiction, was partially inspired by Tolkien's songs. And they gave us a chance to perform or embody the narratives of Lord of the Rings. Now, this is the real father of modern mass media, right? Here's Walt Disney pointing to the park, Disneyland, that's about to open. He's pointing to it in the first episode of the Disneyland television show, which was organized in the segments Fantasyland, Frontierland, Tomorrowland, and so forth, that reflected the structure of the park. And the individual attractions in the park are based on feature films that Disney's studio had produced over the last 20 or 30 years. So Disneyland itself is designed to be an interface into the films on the one hand and the television show on the other. And the television show, in turn, was designed to introduce the theme park. So there's an elaborate structure and model of how you guide readers' experiences through these different media that emerges from Disney's work. The other thing that's striking about Disney, and it's so ubiquitous that we take it for granted today, is that Disney is mixing and matching the mythology. Look at this picture alongside the action figure pictures that I pointed to earlier. Disney imagines a world where these characters from rather different stories come together and becomes part of the Disney parade. That Disney is the guy who introduces and brings together the gang of characters from very different mythologies. And this becomes part of how Disney continues to market his properties down to the present day, that the princesses become one way of creating a set across mythology. These various other things, Disney on Ice combines characters from many different storylands. These all become Disney's characters in part by dissolving the separation between different stories and bringing them together in a combined play space, which we can engage with in creative ways. And Disney, in turn, as he produces games, does much the same. So there's a new Epic Disney game coming out that pits Mickey Mouse against Oswald the Rabbit, a vintage Disney character. And this is Farts. Kingdom Hearts, yeah, I just went blank again. Kingdom Hearts, which combines characters from Japanese games and Disney mythology. The final figure I want to point to in terms of this trajectory is this guy, George Lucas, who created a really rich mythology. Again, we said it informed Mark Warshaw and informed many people of that generation. And it was in part because he got most of his money from making the movies. He ceded the rights as director to the film revenue and took most of the money off these other ancillary products which have come out around Star Wars. And there now is an army of Star Wars stuff and a certain amount of unauthorized Star Wars material. This is the Star Wars strip club in LA that somehow has not gotten shut down yet, but does Stormtrooper burlesque. If we think about the conception of Star Wars, it becomes now the perfect transmedia mythology with many movable parts, with many different extensions, many different worlds, all part of one larger conception, one larger continuity. And in turn, it translates back into toys and action figures that we can play with on the bedroom floor in the sandbox and create our own narratives. So I will end there with that image, but I want us to sort of think about the action figure as the beginning of transmedia the transmedia movement from at least a certain direction. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll take a couple of questions. I'm sort of almost out of time, and I don't know how you're too. Okay. Great. Questions? Yes?
What do you think the next upcoming transmedia technology will be? This seems like a lot of stuff that, it's modern, but it's older. What's in the future of transmedia?
Well, I think the thing to pay attention to is probably the mobile phone, which has finally hit critical mass in the United States after lagging behind most of the rest of the world. And what we're seeing elsewhere is already people developing very location-aware applications of games and so forth that I think will have real interesting implications for what we're calling transmedia. But ultimately, I don't see transmedia as a technical revolution, although there's certainly any new technology will be absorbed into it, as it is a cultural system. And I think in the near future, what we're going to see is better integration of transmedia experiences. Maybe something like the iPad represents one interesting opportunity to move transmedia back into something closer to multimedia, where you can have all of the media easily accessible, easily connected to each other, which will allow us to drill deeper while staying in one spot. Insofar as media flows into one device, then the potential for a multimedia experience that does what transmedia does becomes easier, and it will become more popular, more accessible to people as they feel it's easy to navigate between the scattered parts. The other shift, I think, is going to be in terms of what kinds of stories get told transmedia. So far, because I think it grew out of children's media into adult media, it still tends to be heavily governed by geeky genres like science fiction, fantasy, horror to some degree. We haven't yet seen historical fiction or melodrama or comedy that's very effectively uses transmedia. Some experiments in each space. But I think as that generation grows older and develops adult taste, you're going to see more diversity in terms of the genres represented and more different kinds of audiences served by transmedia experiences. And I think that's another direction forward. There's a lot more, I think, to decide. Is it going to be for niche audiences or the mainstream audiences? It's another question that I think transmedia is going to have to grapple with. And the eye to that is it about scattered pieces or is it about a unified experience? And I think we're going to see more and more discussions and experiments with that.
Hi, I'm curious your take on the role of copyright law in all this, because I was really taken by your juxtapositions of both The Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland, and finally Disney and Star Wars. And I mean, there's such a clear issue that's going to be coming up. I can't imagine someone's going to make another Star Wars movie without Lucas's blessing. And whereas we can go and reach back into history and make a great Greek mythology transmedia, but I mean, when's the next Harry Potter book going to be written?
Yeah, I mean, what is Lawrence Lessig's line that Disney wants to make sure that no one can ever do to its products what it's done with the Brothers Grimm? I think there is something about the different copyright systems at play here. Alice in Wonderland, more than 200 unauthorized extensions in the first 20 years of its production, which Lewis Carroll did nothing to stop. That was taken as given in how copyright works, and the book Alternative Alices makes the case that it's because of that that Lewis Carroll's work became the most quoted work in the English language after Shakespeare and the Bible, both of which also were open text that could be freely quoted and deployed within the culture. Baum's a little different. He tended to create authorized extensions and to sanction the next generation, and then they're continually writing new Oz books down to the present day. Eric Showalter has just published a recent new book in the Wizard of Oz universe. There were certainly unauthorized versions of Oz, but probably much more authorized versions, just an expansive production capacity. By the time we get to Disney and Lucas, they're incredibly litigious. There's a new movie out, People versus George Lucas, which puts Lucas on trial for his crimes against fandom and the ways in which he's turned his back on his audience and has frustrated their ability to create and engage themselves with the works that he threw out to the world. And this is a very lively debate. That said, we do see the Raiders of the Lost Ark video that's unauthorized, and we see the He-Man remixes that are unauthorized. We live in a moment where it is really hard to shut down all remix or unauthorized creativity. And in fact, I think that popular practice will probably ultimately swamp copyright law in terms of its ability to regulate. The system is going to have to give, I think, in some level, and it already is. That the number of cease and desist letters going out to take down fan fiction is dried up almost entirely. It seems to me now the studios tolerate fan fiction as something that they accept as maybe potentially even valuable to them. YouTube still is doing takedown notices pretty aggressively against remix, but even it has an appeals process which sees transformative work and parody as part of a defense against outright copyright theft, and it becomes a much more complex picture at that moment. And I think the law is giving, both in terms of concepts of parody, transformative use, and fair use, are all defenses that have emerged and have been strengthened in recent years as people are pushing back on the right to participate. But there's no question that Disney, if it had been simply Disney's Alice in Wonderland, it would not have had the impact on the culture it did compared to Alice in Wonderland, which could be retold by many different groups for many different purposes.
We have time for one more question. Don't be shy.
Do you ever worry that the technology will actually limit creativity? You know, you got a He-Man action figure, do whatever the heck you want, but as we get into gaming and lines, you know, is that a concern for you?
It's a potential concern, sure. Keep in mind that my parents' generation, and maybe some of my generation, were very worried about those He-Man action figures as being overly specified, as limiting their use, as limiting the imagination. That, again, was part of what Peggy Charon's complaint from Action for Children's Television was about, the limiting of children's imagination by literal embodiments of characters from media franchises. I think kids' imagination is incredibly resilient and flexible, frankly. If there's any way to break the toy and have more fun with it, kids will break the toy. And I think the same is true of electronic toys and games, you know, that you figure out how to manipulate them. I mean, I used to have a Casper the Ghost where you pulled a string and it spoke and had 6 things it could say on a record, but I quickly calculated which it would say when and developed scripts so that Casper always said what I needed to do as I went along in the story. You can always, no matter how limited the device is, open up new ways of engaging with it creatively and expressively. Does it mean that we should over-specify? Probably not. But where do we draw the lines? I do see a value in medium-specific, story-specific characters as tokens that allow easy sharing of fantasy between 2 players. I think there's some real advantages of action figures over sticks and pine cones in terms of enabling a shared experience between 2 players. I think if you limit too much what those stories can do, you do lose some of the flexibility that they're involved with. But I always will root for kids' imagination over toy makers' designs. At the end of the day, it's going to be broken and played with whatever way the kid wants. Great.